I would now like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Pierre Kory. Like our other speakers, tonight, he has shown the courage and determination to fight for the truth and to use his decades of experience as a trainer and as an educator to seek the truth of what is best for his patients. He is highly credentialed, having developed his career running multiple intensive care units, a trauma and life support centre, and throughout the pandemic has published papers, including one that was the first to support the diagnosis of early COVID-19 respiratory diseases as an organised pneumonia, thus explaining the critical response of the disease to corticosteroids. He's a passionate individual who we have the great pleasure of welcoming here tonight. Would you please give a big welcome to my mate, our mate, Dr. Pierre Kory.
Wow. All right. Don't start the clock, because I got to say a couple of things. I'm totally serious. I am starstruck, because I got to share the stage with that man right there. Guys, I speak plainly. I just call it like I see it. But the last 3 years have been rough, and I'm just going to say one insight that I've had as I looked at the world, a world that has gone mad. And it's not that the people in the world are mad or that they're bad or anything. My essential assessment, I'm a diagnostician, that's what you're trained to do as a doctor. My diagnosis of the world is that the world has gone mad from this unprecedented, unrelenting propaganda and censorship. And in this world that went mad, I was like in my office and I'm like, wow, that's crazy. That's crazier. That's crazy. Like the records in absurdity and inanity and insanity kept getting broken every day. But my essential assessment that there were 3 countries at the top that lost their minds most completely. And I don't know what the order they are, but I'm going to give you the 3. You choose the order. It's New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. Now, hold on. The rest of the countries are not that far behind, but you guys are clearly at the top. But here's the thing that I want to bring up about Craig, is that in this fight, I mean, I just did what I thought you were supposed to do as a doctor, which is bring out insights, expertise, guidance, recommendations to try to help anyone. I found just unrelenting attacks from everywhere. But I had people around me to support me. I had my organization, I had my mentors and colleagues like Paul Marek and the other folks in the FLCCC. But I saw and heard this guy named Craig Kelly from across the world, alone, by himself, not without the support of the expertise that I have, speaking truths. And, you know, I was like, I saw this guy making so much sense, and I'm like, yes, and yet he was unique and somewhat alone in a country that had gone mad. And I was like, why aren't they listening to him? But he never stopped. He never backed down. He kept trying to preach pragmatism, rationalism, good sense, open debate, and discussion. And how he could get hammered like he was. And I always wanted to support him. And I don't know. He and I direct messaged a couple times over the last couple of years, and I don't know. Every time I got a thrill, because I knew what he was doing on this part of the world, and I knew what I was doing on that part of the world, and it's an honor for me to be on the stage. By the way, that was a minute and a half that was taken off my talk. So can you reset the clock? Anyone? Okay, let's go. So I already talked about the world going mad, because that's kind of the theme of my talk. It's about a war of information. Those that control the outlets of information are pumping out not very good information. And so I want to correct the record here. Okay. So Also, I want to do a disclaimer where I started, okay? 3 years ago, before COVID started, I was a lifelong avid reader, the New York Times, the pinnacle of journalism, the paper of record. If you wanted to know what was really going on any situation or area of the world, you read the New York Times. That's not a joke. It's not a joke. I literally believe that. I also thought our public health agencies and our governments were there to keep the playing field fair and to sort of, balance these unrelenting, powerful corporate interests with the individual autonomy and sanctity of us citizens. And I thought, I always knew that was a war and a battle, and I just thought government was the referee. I believed in public health. I thought that public health agencies were about public health. And then the really insane thing is I thought Fauci was like a kind of a sympathetic fella, doing the best jobs we could with a lot of critics in a tough spot, right? I'm sure you all felt the same at the beginning. Just admit it. Don't make me the schmuck. All right. So the reason why I put this slide on is because the journey has been really troubling. And the society and the world that I thought I lived in, the implicit faith and trust in the institutions of society that I had, that I thought were working the way they were designed, with good people, with integrity and conviction, is not the world that I've discovered I lived in. It's been very disappointing, very unsettling. But what I take out of that is that means we got a lot of work to do, because that's the world that I want to live in. And I refuse to accept the world that we're living in now. Peter McCullough told me, put in my COVID resume. All I can tell you about my COVID resume, guys, is I'm a pulmonary critical care specialist who, at the age of 50, at the peak of my career, was in a situation where there was a pandemic of a pulmonary and critical care disease overwhelming the globe. And I said, game on. I have been deeply studied on numbers of areas of COVID. That's all I've done from 3 years, 24/7, mostly on therapeutics, trying to figure out how to treat and save lives. That's all I've done. That's all my colleagues have done. And I'm proud of that effort. I think this is a historic time, and all of the stuff that has befallen me, I wouldn't change anything. And just to give me some props here, but like the first time I actually advocated in public, I was asked to testify about my expertise about treatment of the hospital phase of COVID, and Ron Johnson asked me to testify. And it was clear to me within months of this pandemic that corticosteroids were life-saving and critically important in the hospital phase of the disease. I testified in the Senate at a time when every national and international healthcare organization around the world was saying, don't use corticosteroids. Wait, what's the first one at the top? Oh, shoot. Australia. But don't worry, they weren't alone. They weren't alone. And when I came out with that recommendation, I got hammered. I've written countless times about this. I mean, I really got destroyed because I was somehow coming up with an opinion which departed from the consensus. You never want to depart from the consensus, do you? Okay. But what's interesting about this point, the point I want to make is that 2 months later, my advocacy and my insight was actually validated. Corticosteroids became the standard of care overnight for the hospital phase of this disease. And people recognized that I'd gotten it right. They quickly forgot it, right, as soon as I got into ivermectin. But I'm going to tell you, this is not my first rodeo, okay? So here's where the problem started. And the problem started is that we kept reviewing, me, Paul, the rest of my organization, the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance. Anyone? We kept studying therapeutics. We were following all the trials, all the data, all the mechanisms. And around October of 2020, 6, 7 months into the pandemic, we started to see a signal around ivermectin that we hadn't seen around any other therapeutic. It was remarkable. Different centers and countries, different trial designs, large magnitude benefits in mortality and hospitalization. And I did a deep dive. Paul first brought it to attention. I started to write a review paper, and I was asked to testify. And I'm going to get back to that in a second. But let's just start with a description of the system that we're in. Let's look at this slide. So this is a forest plot. If you guys can see that gray line that's vertical right down the middle, all the green diamonds are to the left. But that gray line is when the estimated treatment effect of a medicine is essentially zero. The harms and benefits are equal. It's just ineffectual. It doesn't hurt you, it doesn't help you. Anything to the left of that line is where there's an estimated treatment benefit. And all of those diamonds, those green diamonds, are actually treatment benefits that are derived from an analysis of a collection of trials. It's called a meta-analysis. It's a very important process that we do when we assess therapies in medicine. Meta-analysis for decades has been considered the strongest level of evidence for any therapeutic. And so when you see those treatment benefits, and the farther to the left from the line you are, the more potent the therapy it is. Those are derived from numbers of trials. If it's still in gray, like at the top, those gray diamonds, that's just because there's only a couple of trials. But as soon as you have 4 or more, they made it green in this protocol. Did any of you know that there's like 43 positive therapeutics in COVID? Did you know how many there were that actually would help you in COVID? No, right? What do you guys know? Paxlovid? Yeah, right? So the point of this slide, though, is so many different therapeutics have been found to be effective in mitigating the adverse effects of this illness, or in treating it or reversing it. What did I circle? What I circled above is the only therapeutics recommended by the United States of America. Different country. Maybe it's the same country as Australia, kind of. Seems like you guys copy us. I don't know why you would do that. You guys are... Anyway, but literally, the United States of America, these are the only recommended medicines. Anyone see a common theme to those medicines? If you look at the third column and you look at the cost, isn't that weird? So why aren't any of the $1, $3, $5 therapies and interventions readily available to all? Why are they not recommended? Not even vitamin D. It's because this is the system that we're living in, right? The results of a system is the system to which it's designed to produce those results. I mean, I always knew that in medicine that there was a little corruption. Of course, pharma's there. They have their corrupt influence. I always thought there was a little bit of corruption. You always had to be a little bit skeptical, right? That's how I started. It's very different now. I didn't know how baked in and how controlled and corrupt the system is. But in COVID, it's exposed everything, even to a dummy like me, all right? So if you go back, right, let's go back to that last slide. I put a box around ivermectin, right? 93 controlled trials. It's actually 95 now. 120,000 patients. Repeated large magnitude benefits in all the important outcomes, and yet it's a horse dewormer. That's what my talk is about, is trying to explain to you how that happened, how we got from this to a horse dewormer, which I understand in Australia is like a level 8 poison, right? Like, if you're a doctor and you prescribe it, you lose your license, your career is done, no livelihood, and then like the people get poisoned. Okay. Clown world? Okay. But that's the point of this slide. So here's the thing. Why would they not promote ivermectin? Obviously, it's so clear to all of you if you're here. Ivermectin presents the single greatest threat to the pharmaceutical industry in history. And it presents the single greatest threat to this suddenly newly opened market overnight with this pandemic, right? When this pandemic opened, it opened up a huge global vaccination campaign and a market for these stupid antivirals like Paxlovid and Molnupiravir. They want to protect that market. Before the pandemic started, when they did simulation exercises with the world-leading organizations, what do we do if there's a viral pandemic? You know what they decided in those simulation exercises? The number one threat to an effective response was something called vaccine hesitancy. Ivermectin presented the greatest threat to vaccine hesitancy, meaning if you knew that there was a highly effective, safe, readily available, inexpensive medication that could get you out of COVID without having to do an experimental gene transfer technology therapy that was barely tested by a pharmaceutical company, most of you probably been like, I'll take the ivermectin, correct? My point is that it's actually not about ivermectin. I want to make this point clear. It's about the attack on repurposed drugs. I've been told that Australians don't know what repurposed drugs are, so let me explain to you what a repurposed drug is. It's a drug that's already went through regulatory approval for a specific indication. It's been approved. It's in use for a specific disease. It's later found to have mechanisms which are salutary or effective in other diseases, so we repurpose it. You get it, Australia? Okay. So the single greatest threat to the entire business model of the pharmaceutical industry is repurposed drugs. They've been attacking them for decades in psychiatry, in cardiology, and oncology. Anytime a new medicine falls off of patent protection where anyone can manufacture it and there's not a lot of profit to be made, they attack the old drugs because they want you to take the pricey new patented pharmaceuticals. This is what they've been doing for decades. So I want to tell you, it's not about ivermectin as a unique medicine. It's about the latest in the war on repurposed drugs over decades by the pharmaceutical industry, which is the largest industry on earth. It dwarfs coal and gas. I don't think you guys know that. It is massive. It's the single biggest lobbyist in our government in the United States of America. It is so much power and financial power. Here's the thing. So they've been trying to destroy repurposed drugs for decades. Now you have a global pandemic with a new market that opens up in the hundreds of billions and potentially even trillions of dollars if this nonsense goes on, and you have little old ivermectin in the way, right? I'm just trying to set the scene here, guys. This is to tell you what happened next. I mean, they had to destroy ivermectin. Okay. How did they do it? I didn't know. When I gave my testimony, it kind of went viral, and suddenly people started to discuss ivermectin. It became kind of something in the public sphere. I was very kind of shocked because I didn't think I'd get a ticker tape parade or anything, but like I thought people would be like, "Hey, great idea, sounds good. The evidence is, pretty compelling. Let's just give it to everyone because it's so safe." But that's not what happened. I mean, there's unending attacks and discussions and all these erudite, credentialed doctors. There's insufficient evidence for this, and I saw just insanity. I'm like, people are dying, man. This is a safe drug. Just use it. All the evidence shows that it works, right? Nothing made sense to me until March of 2021, which is 3 months after my testimony. It was a very difficult 3 months because I really couldn't figure out what was going on. I was having a lot of trouble professionally and personally. And a professor sent me an email. It's actually an Australian professor. He lives in San Francisco for the last 20 years, but he's a world expert in vitamin D. And suddenly I got this email one day, and he said, "Dr. Kory, what they've been doing to ivermectin, they've been doing to vitamin D for decades." And he gave me a link to this article called The Disinformation Playbook. You can still Google it. It'll be #1 if you Google it, for now. But it's a really interesting article because it's short, it's brief, and it's impactful. And I read it, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. They're doing that. They did that yesterday. They're doing that to me today. I saw that the other week. Everything that I was witnessing and couldn't figure out made sense. It was like suddenly the world was ordered in my new perspective. And that's what this lecture is about. What happens when industries confront science that is inconvenient to their interests, they embark on disinformation campaigns. Disinformation tactics were invented in the 1950s by a public relations firm hired by the tobacco industry. Why would the tobacco industry hire a public relations firm in the 1950s? Because science was emerging inconvenient to their interests. People are like, oh, wow, if you smoke, you get heart attacks and cancers and strokes. And the tobacco guys are like, oh, we got to stop this kind of discussion, right? And so basically what you saw is 50 years of media manipulation and counterfeit science. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, because I think the core of this is actually the fraud at the heart of science. So I gave testimony. As some of you may know, I was kind of pissed off that day. And I was literally exhausted. I've been working so hard. I literally was doing 24/7 COVID. If this wasn't working, taking care of patients, it was studying and reading and collaborating. And thank you. And I was honored to be asked to testify again in the U.S. Senate, and I did. And I put forth the evidence for ivermectin, and I think because I lost my temper, it went viral. People kind of liked that I was pissed off because I think the whole world was pissed off. They identified, right? You guys identified? And, you know, what happened next, one really cool thing about this slide is that we were invited to the National Institutes of Health to present our data, because at that time, the National Institutes of Health of the United States of America had a recommendation around ivermectin, which is do not use outside of a clinical trial. It was the only medicine that people thought might be helpful that had that recommendation. Every other medicine, it was insufficient evidence to suggest or to recommend or not recommend. But ivermectin was very weird, and I've never understood that, why it suddenly had a very restrictive recommendation when there was no evidence around it. Anyway, we presented at NIH, and they changed their recommendation, and they changed it to that neutral one. So I think we did already something which allowed it to be considered. But here's the thing. I didn't know then, I told you guys already, I learned later that that testimony landed myself and my organization in the midst of a decades-long war on repurposed drug, a war that was never more heated than in this new pandemic. But let's go back in time. Look at this slide. So Satoshi Omura, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for discovering ivermectin, because based on that discovery of ivermectin's properties as an anti-parasite medicine, it transformed the health status of a good portion of the globe. Multiple low and middle income countries around the world ravaged with parasitic diseases, things like river blindness, where you'd have communities where men over 40 were all blind and had to be led around by sticks throughout Africa. Suddenly, sight was restored. You didn't have blindness. And it was one of the most tremendous historical impacts of the discovery of a medicine. But here's the thing. Satoshi Omura knew that there was 10 years of in vitro data showing that it stopped the replication of numbers of RNA viruses. He knew it was a broad antiviral as well. So what did he do? He reached out to his old partner, Merck. The original ivermectin was developed along with Merck, but that was the old Merck, not the new Merck. Things have changed in the last 50 years, apparently. Just like when I thought, I believed in good government that was leveling the playing field. It's a little outdated. I get it. I'm learning. I'm coming along. Just give me time. But what they say? We have no interest in studying, which is totally predictable, right? Why would a pharmaceutical company study a drug they can't make money off of because it's off patent? They wouldn't want to do it. But I just want to say that just shows you, before there was any evidence to say it worked or didn't work, they didn't want to look at it. Important, no? Okay. Then, after my testimony, within 3 months, Merck comes out, middle of the night, on February 3rd, 2021. I wake up in the morning on February 4th, and I have to read these 3 statements. This is after I presented to the Senate with, at the time, maybe 33 trials, 13 or 14 were randomized, the vaunted, randomized, double-blind, prospective trials. I mean, immense amount of evidence. And suddenly, Merck comes up with this, puts it on their website. They say, our company scientists have determined this. No authors, no data. 3 statements. Now, I'm an old lefty, guys. Big Pharma's evil, right? I mean, you don't listen to Big Pharma. They're full of crap. Of course they're going to lie to us, right? That's what I thought. I thought that was understood by everybody. But what was unsurprising, not that they did this, but the reaction is all across the world, all major media, New York Times, everyone blaring, Merck says that ivermectin doesn't work. Merck, the arbiter of scientific truth and objectivity, has determined without any data that ivermectin doesn't work. And that's when I started to get really scared. I'm like, what world are we living in? Why did this disseminate across the globe through all media based on some stupid statement by a pharmaceutical company when my paper showed that it did work? All right. All right. So one thing that I don't do anymore, and I did for a year, is I presented endless lectures and podcasts and interviews where I carefully amassed the data, the randomized control trials, the observation control trials, the health ministry data, all showing how effective ivermectin is. I don't do it anymore. Why don't I do it anymore? Because this is not a data argument. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm not here to prove to you that ivermectin works. It is the most proven drug in any disease model I've ever studied in my career. Period. You're talking about 95 studies, 134,000 patients from numerous centers and countries around the world with unmistakable, reproducible, large magnitude benefits in time to viral clearance, time to clinical recovery, hospitalizations, and death. Actually, I'm sorry, I changed that. I think we should do one more trial, don't you guys think? Should we do one more? One more? Okay. So what's going on here? I mean, how many trials do we have to do? Well, it's about this information. So how did they destroy this evidence base? This is what I want to walk you guys through. You have 95 controlled trials. This is a meta-analysis combining all of those trials, the highest level of evidence. What happened was they changed the rules of medical evidence. And what happened is they dismissed all of the trials except for, wait for it, the large, high-quality, rigorous trials. Big, funded by who? The agencies in pharma. And literally, they reduced this entire evidence base to, I would say, 5 trials out of the 95, the biggest, most large, rigorous, high-quality ones, right, from august institutions with heavily credentialed study investigators, the best of science, guys. The best of science provided 5 trials which killed ivermectin. Those 5 trials were all published in the highest impact journals of the world, which is New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of American Medical Association, British Medical Journal, The Lancet, and the Annals of Internal Medicine. What I discovered, remember, I always thought there was a little bit of fraud in medicine, but what I discovered is that the root of everything I'm going to tell you starts at the level of the high-impact medical journals. Those 5 journals, I've since discovered, because I've studied this, have been captured for decades. There are former editors of those journals who have resigned and written books about how corrupt those journals are. They have said over 50% of anything published in there is false. It's all manipulated. They want you to use drugs that are toxic and barely effective, and they want you to not use therapies that apparently don't work, right? And I didn't know how bad it was, but this is basically what they pulled off, and that's just what I want to say. If you're interested in going deeper dive on what I say, go to my Substack. I go over each one of these trials. I've written extensive white papers detailing every single crazy, I don't want to curse, bat blank crazy stuff that they pulled that is so brazen. What shocked me was that it was so obvious what they were doing. They were manipulating designs and trial data, and no one was talking about it. But I've written extensively on it. I would argue that you should go to my Substack. Here's my favorite. This is the most recent. This is the National Institutes of Health, who finally funded a study in ivermectin. And here's the funny thing. So number one, they allowed up to 14 days to entry, which, never mind, it's so stupid, I don't even want to talk about it. But this is just one study participant who, by the time he got to study medicine, was totally well and better. They weren't open on weekends, by the way. So, like, if you were sick, you had to wait for the weekend to be over to get your medicine. This is how they run this trial. But here's what's more brilliant. The initial protocol said, we're going to compare the symptom severity at 14 days. Not unreasonable. I think that's reasonable. But in the middle of the trial, nobody saw the data. They suddenly changed the protocol, and they said, actually, we're going to compare symptom severity at 28 days. You guys want to think about that for a second? Acute viral syndrome, which lasts 5, 7, 10 days. You think it's important to compare the severity at 28 days? Okay. So they changed it to 28 days, because let's trust them, right? There wasn't enough statistical power. Okay. Here's the results. This is literally in the presentation of their trial by the principal investigator, who is so steeped in pharma, she literally owns stock in competitors to ivermectin. She goes before the NIH, totally credentialed from one of the top universities in the world, and she presents this data. A statistically significant positive result is when the posterior P is above 0.95. Let's walk through this. Day 7, posterior P, 0.97. Go ivermectin. Day 14, Posterior P is 0.98. It works. Wait, day 28, 0.74. That's a statistically significant result. Therefore, the conclusions of that paper was there's no role for ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19. Do you guys think I'm making this up? Read the paper. This is clown world, absolute clown world, and nobody's paying attention. You want me to go further? I'll go further. Oxford, the University of Oxford, right? They do a trial. Look at this slide. Professor Butler, the august Chris Butler, he does 2 trials. One, he's studying molnupiravir from Merck. The other one, the off-patented old drug ivermectin. Okay, principles of the same trial, both, he's studying antivirals. So what does he do? Okay, so in molnupiravir, he manages to randomize 25,000 patients within a median of 2 days of symptoms. And he chooses high-risk patients where you're going to show the most likelihood of benefit. In ivermectin, hold on, where's my laser? You can be sick for 13 days and get in that trial. I don't know any doctor who treats a viral disease and waits for 13 days. Why would these things be so different? Does anyone have any answer for that? I think it was just an oversight. It was a mistake. It was harmless. No intent here, right? They just said, it's easier if we just allow enrollment up to 14 days. And the other thing is, there's no antiviral in history that's used for less than 5 days. Wait, how long did they use ivermectin for? 3 days. And they used the mildest patients. This is absolute joke. This is literally found in protocols and in journals. Nobody talks about it. Okay, it gets worse, guys. Same trial, Oxford. They start this trial, and 6 months into it, they make this very public announcement that they ran out of ivermectin. Not making this up. You guys think I'm making this up. This became a really, for those of us paying attention like me, because I'm Mr. Ivermectin, I was like, what? They ran out of ivermectin? That's crazy. The last functioning journalist in the world, Mei-Ling Lee, says, okay, I'm going to do some journalism here. I'm going to call the supplier and ask them if they've run out. So she called Edenbridge Pharmaceuticals in New Jersey, who was supplying all of their ivermectin, said, hey, did you guys run out of ivermectin? They're like, no, we're good. We have plenty of supply. So now you have the principal trial over the, across the pond in the UK. It was like, yeah, okay, I guess we'll continue our trial. So they continue their trial. Here's the killer. That's actually an outdated slide. That trial finished enrolling well over 200 days ago. There hasn't been a press release, a preprint server, or a publication. Do you guys remember remdesivir? So when remdesivir trial ended, you had Fauci in the Oval Office. This is a game changer, right? You guys remember that? And suddenly, within days, the US government signs a contract for $2 billion, buys all these doses of remdesivir. Not one doctor in the world saw the trial data. Nothing. It was a press campaign. And then the data trickles out later. They also changed their primary endpoint in their trial. They did so much shenanigans. It was so absurdly corrupt. And I'm sitting there in my office, like pulling the little hair that I have. Like, how can this be happening? No one's talking about it. So, but the point of it is this. Literally, after all the fraudulent trials that they've published in these high-impact journals, I think they're really stuck here. They don't know what to do. Should they publish and manipulate and massage and change endpoints and figure out how to publish a negative result? Or maybe just sit tight and don't publish it? What do you got? Yeah, I heard a yeah. I agree with you. Okay. All right, I got to go quicker. The other things that they did, and by the way, my point is this. The core of everything begins at those journals, because if you don't have the fraudulent sciences of those journals, you can't generate the PR campaigns and all of these august doctors, saying, well, the large, rigorous trials show that it was not effective. All the other ones in the black and brown countries, we can't trust those. They're poor quality, right? So all those narratives wouldn't be possible if you didn't control the journals. What you don't know, and this is also speaks to censorship, is you don't know what got rejected. I've written extensively, because I know all of the investigators around the world, I wouldn't say all, but many of them who I've become collegial with, they told me they cannot publish their trials in any reputable journal. Positive trials of ivermectin of the highest quality designs rejected. And there's a pretty standard template for rejections when you try to submit a scientific manuscript, and it always includes this one sentence. We have found that your study is of not sufficient interest to our readership at this time. In the middle of a pandemic, with a positive medicine that's safe and available to all, it's not of sufficient interest? Clown world. Okay. They also retracted my paper. Again, go to my Substack, read about this. They retracted colleagues of mine, Tess Laurie. By the way, in our careers at the FLCCC, if you look at all of us, I would say 130 years in academia, thousands of papers published, never having one retracted. The only times we've heard of retractions are when the data was proven to be fraudulent or plagiarized. And here we were with a paper that passed through rounds of peer review by some senior scientists selected from the NIH and CDC. My editor of my first submission to the journal, The Frontiers in Pharmacology, my editor was a guy named Robert Malone. Anyone? Yeah. And that was Robert before he was Robert. So I always say this joke, I'm sure it pisses off Robert, but during that stuff, when we realized that the fix was in, they were going to retract our paper, you know, I'm getting killed out in public, and I'm like, Robert, and he was just really very experienced, very knowledgeable. He'd been involved in pandemic responses for government for decades with Ebola and all this stuff, and I was like, Robert, man, I'm getting killed out here. I could use a little help. And he said to me, if they can't see you, they can't shoot you. And I was like, ooh, okay. He's like, I prefer working behind the scenes. And then like 2 months later, he's out there with a target on his back bigger than anybody's. He's on YouTube, he's on Twitter, he's getting deplatformed, everyone hates him, and I don't know, whatever. But I will say this, Robert and me, we're like the newcomers. The OG, the original gangster, is Peter McCullough, okay? I mean, he's been out in front since the beginning of this pandemic, talking about early treatment, calling attention to the issues with the vaccines. He's been so consistent and entirely right. Objective, no conflicts of interest, expert, and helpful. He's gotten killed as well as the rest of us, but I'm going to say science is broken. Okay, so also the other thing I learned is not a good idea. So I learned that it's not a good idea to submit your manuscripts to journals that are funded by Bill Gates. It's my 2 clicks to Bill Gates rule. Like anytime you see nonsense, like really crazy, fraudulent scientific stuff, just look where the funders are. You'll find Bill and Melinda Gates there. But here's the thing, with that corruption of science, this slide is really important. This is propaganda. So propaganda is a story or a message that gets you to think or act in a certain way. You have no idea how much propaganda you're surrounded by. It's gotten so bad. I've learned about this. Remember, I thought the New York Times was the pinnacle of journalism and wouldn't traffic in this stuff. Now that I see what they did around ivermectin, I don't believe anything anymore. Like what I'm told to think or believe about Ukraine, bullshit. I don't know what the truth is. And here's the thing. I don't pretend to know what the truth about Ukraine is. I just know it's not what they say it is. So, but here's the propaganda around ivermectin, and you can pick up any major media article about ivermectin. You will find, it's almost like a crossword puzzle or Scrabble or whatever the thing is where you're looking for the words in the grid. You'll find these terms. They will pop up, usually quoted with some highly credentialed, lettered academic, who will very arrogantly say, oh, all those positive trials, they're low quality, they're small, they can't be trusted, some are fraudulent, they're only in countries with worms. You know, people who think they're real are these ivermectin advocates like me, you know, whose interests are like, yeah, you know, ivermectin's done awesome for my career, by the way, guys. Like, I lost 3 jobs, had no money for a while. My academic career is completely finished. And, yeah, go ivermectin. And it just goes on and on. So you have these editorials filling these journals, the most august journals that I venerated as the best of science and scientists, putting out these crazy editorials just attacking ivermectin. And then they go after, like a colleague of mine, Dr. Andrew Hill, he was the lead researcher for the WHO and Unitaid, of a team looking for repurposed generic drugs that might be effective in COVID. He knew ivermectin worked. I talked to him, we were sharing data and insights. He started giving lectures to countries saying, get ready, get your supplies, get ready to deploy. And then suddenly, the tune changed. It's called regulatory capture at the individual level. It's called the fix. They got Randy. I could see suddenly there was something wrong with him. And he started working against ivermectin. Here's what he did. His first paper he published was 24 randomized controlled trials showing numerous statistically significant benefits in time to viral clearance, time to clinical recovery, hospitalizations, and death. Within 2 weeks of the publication of that paper in a prominent journal, suddenly, newspapers started talking about one of the studies in his paper was fraudulent. The reason why I bring that up, guys, how are you going to destroy an evidence base of 24 randomized controlled trials, which actually ignored all of the other trials, just randomized? How are you going to destroy it? Remember, disinformation is injecting doubt where there is none. So, once they called out one for fraud, and by the way, I knew the principal investigator of that trial. He went quiet real quick. His name was Ahmed Al-Ghazar. I was like, Ahmed, what's going on here, man? What is this going? What are you doing? And he's like, that's not my data. I don't know what they're talking about. And then he never replied to any of us ever again. He went super quiet. His university went quiet. But that built the narrative that this evidence base was built on fraud, injecting doubt where there is none. So now the entire world is like, oh, we can't believe anything about ivermectin. Really smart. These people are assassins. They know how to get you to think and act. Now, here's the other thing. So, when that trial was proven fraud, we couldn't prove it was or wasn't. My own review paper, the editor asked me to reformat my analysis. I did. I did the analysis. I took that trial out, redid the analysis, same conclusions. This actually didn't change our conclusions. We had plenty of data. So did Tess Lawrie. What did Andrew do? This. Clown world. So he takes the entire evidence base, which shows a highly statistically significant benefit on survival, and he excludes potentially fraudulent studies. I cannot find in the literature the definition of a potentially fraudulent study, but he came up with his own. Then he excludes high-risk studies, which actually has a definition, fine, and then he excludes this other category. What is it? Studies with some concerns. And then he ends up and he says there's no impact on mortality. Okay. The WHO did the same thing. One of the most important things that I want you to know about the WHO guidelines and the use of ivermectin in COVID is that in the very beginning of their treatment guidelines, they say, we did not include studies of ivermectin in the prevention of COVID. You guys see this evidence base for prevention? It's stronger than treatment. The entire world has ignored this. This is like 16 trials now, massive reductions in the incidence of COVID. The WHO just very casually in their little document says, we didn't want to review those trials. Anyone want to have a reason why they wouldn't want to review those trials? There you go. Vaccine hesitancy is another acceptable answer. So anyway, and they did the same thing as Andy. They just removed all trials that they could for inane reasons. I'm pulling my hair out. I wrote a white paper on this, which exactly nobody read. But anyway, I kept trying to do the right thing. And then I also like to call attention. You guys remember that pandemic of scabies 10 years ago that created the world, lockdowns and all that stuff? Well, in that pandemic, the WHO recommended ivermectin for scabies based on 10 RCTs involving 800 patients. That's why you don't remember the pandemic, because it ended. Huh? And, you know, really everything relies on the media. And I'm going to finish here because, now I'm seeing how far over I am. I'm 1 minute and 30. I'm going to finish in 3 minutes, my friends. This is about the media. So the rot of the corruption is in the sciences, but then the media just amplifies it. So you have this thing called the Trusted News Initiative, which is essentially the apogee of journalism and media that gets together and they realize that they have to control information. You guys want to let that sink in for a second? So the press has decided that they need to censor and control information. And everyone happily does that. Agence France Presse, Associated Press, BBC, CBC, whatever. They all get together. Gotta quiet down the misinformationists like me, right? And amplify the disinformationists, which is really sad. The US government paid $1 billion to media companies to do this. This is what fuels all the narratives. This is why every article on ivermectin is a blueprint. It's a template. They all follow the same script. You see this over and over and over again. You see the same statements about ivermectin. And if you hear it enough, what do you believe? It's a horse dewormer, it's crap, and the only people who think it works are unserious scientists who are anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorists, and quack fringe doctors. Correct? We're all clear? Thank you. That's propaganda. And then you have social media censoring discussion of drugs before, actually, they were proven not to work. Isn't that weird? Before those big, rigorous trials showed that it didn't work, they were already censoring discussion. Isn't that backwards? Wouldn't it make more sense if you did it afterwards? Just saying. Just some of my thoughts I'm sharing with you. And then they go after me and my organization. We're getting hammered everywhere, deplatformed, demonetized. We can't get donations to our organization. Shopify drops us. Our PayPal drops us. Our press releases don't go out. And then just real quick here, in the middle of this censorship, this is the most horrific example of censorship, which is they censored the single greatest public health achievement in the history of modern medicine. This is what they censored, is a North Indian state in India, 241 million people in one state. And in that state, led by a Hindu monk who was elected to power on an anti-corruption platform, chose his best public health leaders and epidemiologists to put together, he called it Team 11. They first used hydroxychloroquine widely, and then they discovered that ivermectin was more effective, and they switched it to that. And what they did is they employed 162,000 healthcare workers, traveling across the state, visiting 97,000 villages, testing. Anyone who tested positive, they got ivermectin. Anyone tested positive, the household got ivermectin. All the healthcare workers were taking ivermectin. And after the Delta wave, by September of 2021, they reported that in the last 2.5 million tests, they had 200 positives, which is effectively zero. 67 of the 75 districts in that state of 241 million people, not patients, had not a new case. 33 of the 75 didn't have any active cases. You guys remember that on Australia Today, right? Headline? You guys remember that day when you were like, wow, go to No? Okay. Because it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? This was censored at an insane, almost unconscionable scale. Not only did the success of Uttar Pradesh not appear on any major newspaper around the world, it didn't even appear in India. So two major Indian newspapers, which earlier in Uttar Pradesh's program had talked about the use of ivermectin, when these results were being promoted or being disseminated around India, they wrote these glowing articles about how well Uttar Pradesh did. What's the word that was missing? Ivermectin. They literally didn't mention ivermectin. Even the WHO wrote this glowing piece about what Uttar Pradesh did, and they championed the contact tracing, and the massive testing, and the quarantining, and all this great public health work they were doing, and they didn't mention ivermectin. Isn't this a comedy, guys? Like, I'm not making this stuff up. This is real life. This is history. This is our lives right now, where you're literally having a country that eradicated a virus from its borders and no one talks about it. This is absolute insanity. This is the world that we live in. It's gone mad. Oh boy. I'm really going over. You guys knew I was going to go over, so screw you. 2 more minutes. The last 2 tactics, the blitz, where they go after the researchers. Remember, what is the enemy of propaganda? It's truth. What is the enemy of propagandists? It's truth tellers. Who do they go after? The truth tellers. How do they go after you? They could kill you. And by the way, I was very nervous starting my car for a while. I literally was like, they don't care if thousands and millions of people die. Why would they care if I die, right? I was actually quite worried. Now I'm like, they would have killed me already. So I think I'm good, but who knows? But they go after you. They have lists. This has been documented over decades. And I started to see hit jobs everywhere going after me. Like, I literally have just tried to practice medicine with integrity, with honesty, with openness, willingness, and transparency, and discussion and debate. I don't have any conflicts of interest, and I'm being portrayed as like the worst doctor in the world. And I'm not alone. Peter's right beside me. All of my friends where I do podcasts and interviews, they're getting demonetized and taken down off of YouTube. I can't speak anywhere. They're taking away my voice. My Wikipedia page is a joke. A friend of mine tries to edit it on July 4th, which is a national holiday in the United States. He makes one factual correction, just as a test thing, to my Wikipedia page. 90 seconds later, it's reverted back on July 4th. Okay? They keep close tabs on those things. And this is the attacks on me, Paul Marik, my organization, Robert Malone. Oh, they love Robert Malone almost as much as they love Peter, right? Peter gets hammered everywhere for being a misinformationist. My colleague Ryan Cole, they go on and on. But here's where it gets real. It's not about hit jobs anymore. Our careers ended, guys. Paul Marik is the most published practicing intensivist in the history of our specialty. His career is done. He no longer sees patients. He no longer has a clinical position. Umberto Meduri, world expert on the treatment of corticosteroids and critical illness, his career is done. All of his research lab, his biosamples, no longer accessible to him. I've lost 3 jobs. I'm still standing. Flavio Cattegiani, accused of crimes against humanity. These people do not mess around. Believe me, I've been living this for 3 years. I gave a lecture on vitamin C. Didn't mention ivermectin or COVID. I'm an expert on vitamin C, and the organizer put that lecture up on YouTube, and it was taken down within an hour for misinformation. It's not good out there, guys. All right, let me finish. I'm only 9 minutes over, which is better than yesterday. So I'm going to finish in 30 seconds. Sue Ellen and James. This is the finale. What was the death knell to ivermectin? It was a public relations campaign already set up, organized by assassins of PR. They know what they're doing. They know how to get you to think and act in a certain way. You know what I'm talking about? The horse dewormer campaign, right? How did it start? Well, it was triggered by this. Middle of August, late phase Delta, 2021, you had 90,000 prescriptions of ivermectin a week in the United States. They got spooked. By the way, I'm going to want to take credit for that, by the way. That was me. I wouldn't say me, but myself and my colleagues and people around the world. Craig Kelly's probably part of that too. But they got spooked, and they said, it's go time. So what did they do? They started out with our CDC sending out a memo to every state health department, which then sent it to every licensed physician in that state. It's dangerous, there's overdoses, the FDA hasn't approved it, don't use it. They forgot to mention that the FDA doesn't have to approve it because it's already approved and you can do off. It's weird that they forgot that. Don't you think it was unhelpful? Singularly unhelpful, don't you think? I thought so. I was like, weird. I would have put that in right in the middle saying, although the FDA hasn't approved it, you can still use it. Okay, anyway, that's just me. I'm crazy. But then this went around, and then the FDA jumps in with this viral tweet. You guys saw this tweet? You're not a horse, you're not a cow, y'all? That whole thing? Around the world on everyone's list, ridiculing all of those poor saps who think that ivermectin works, right? Exactly. And so this continues. And then the AMA, these are all physician societies with no authority to do so, they call for an immediate end to prescribing. No authority. Who asked you to, what? What are you doing here? It's about trying to get the doctors to stop. And then every late night talk show host, daytime host, radio host, newspaper, For 2 weeks, ivermectin is never mentioned. What is mentioned? Horse dewormer. In the middle of this crap, Joe Rogan gets COVID, and he says, I got treated with ivermectin. The media has a field day. It's absolutely insane. And then there's this. Anyone? You guys remember this? Did this make it over to Australia? It did? All right. Can I read through it with you for a second? Because I get confused every time I see it, but let's just go through it slowly. Gunshot victims left waiting as horse dewormer overdoses overwhelm Oklahoma hospitals, doctor says. So when I read it, I was troubled. I was like, oh, those poor gunshot wound victims, like holding in the blood that's dripping onto their shoes while they're wheeling in the ivermectin overdose. I was like, that's crazy. Why would you do that? These people know how to get your attention, by the way. And, you know, the old adage about, you know, a lie goes halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. The very next day, the hospital's like, we haven't had any ivermectin overdoses, and we don't even know that doctor. He hasn't worked here in months. But here's the question you should ask yourself. Rolling Stone, which is known, has a history of being kind of a source of excellent investigative journalism. How did that article show up in such a media outlet? Don't you think that's weird? And easily disprovable with one phone call. Like, isn't like journalism fact-checking before you put something out there? Anyway, all right, I'm gonna finish here, and then we ended up with this. This is my last slide, I'm done. I'm 13 minutes over. Let's just look at this. So in the middle of this PR campaign, who do they trot out on national television in the United States of America? Your friend and mine, the sympathetic fella, Anthony Fauci. All right, let's play it.
Senators are reporting that their calls are spiking in places like Mississippi and Oklahoma because some Americans are trying to use an anti-parasite horse drug called ivermectin to treat coronavirus, to prevent contracting coronavirus. What would you tell someone who is considering taking that drug?
Don't do it. There's no evidence whatsoever that that works, and it could potentially have toxicity, as you just mentioned, with people who have gone to poison control centers because they've taken the drug at a ridiculous dose and wind up getting sick. There's no clinical evidence that indicates that this works.
Guys, I'm gonna leave you with this. Don't do it. There's no clinical evidence that this works. Thank you. I know you're gonna...